I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. Some of the themes that I'm going to discuss regarding this film are quite heavy. So those include anti-sex work sentiments and violence, homophobia and transphobia, colonial violence, human rights violations, and political assassinations. They're probably only going to be briefly mentioned, and I will not go into detail, especially regarding the violence. But if that is something you don't feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this episode. I'm also going to say up top that it is very hot in the UK right now, and I'm having to record with a fan blowing directly at my face. So I apologize if the audio is a bit disturbed by the sound of this fan, but I literally cannot turn it off. I cannot turn it off because it is so hot and I have to get this recorded. So yeah, I will try to sort it in editing to make sure it's not intrusive, but yeah, I thought I'd let you know. On with the episode. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema and weigh up its good and bad and hilarious elements. So it's been a while. This summer for me has been quite unproductive, if I'm being honest. The main thing I've been working on is this podcast, and even that I've kind of struggled to pull together. I've been trying to release some poetry, a poetry trap book. It's not happening at the moment. I'm really struggling to get it to come together. And it's not even like the actual work itself. That's finished. I just cannot finalize putting it out there. I'm also attempting, I haven't started anything to do more writing, like film writing on my blog, and that's not really been happening. I think the last thing I released I posted in May or April, so quite a while ago. But if you have missed me, I update this podcast monthly. If you'd like to follow me on Letterboxd, that is probably where I'm most active. Bionic Walker, that's my username. I've taken a break from Twitter at the moment, pretty much not on there at all, because I've been trying to avoid spoilers of The Bear, because the newest season came out in June, and I was just like, I don't want anyone to spoil this, and because they dropped the whole season all at once, I just didn't want to see clips or photos or memes or anything. I wanted to enjoy it. I have, as of recording this podcast, one episode left. I still haven't finished it, and it's because I'm kind of enjoying not being on Twitter. It's been an interesting experience, if I'm being honest. Yeah, my brain's been kind of fried. And I will say that the podcast itself has been a nice distraction. I think even if it has been kind of hard to get to come together, this is maybe the longest intro I've done in quite a while. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce the film. We can get on with it, because that's probably why you're here. So, the film that I am going to be talking about today is Señorita.
When you have Filipino films that have queer characters, especially gay and trans characters, are almost always the object of derision or ridicule. They are kind of one-dimensional, stereotypical characters, and so I wanted to make a film that was grittier, that was maybe a little more morally complex and layered. And it was when I watched Clute and Jane Fonda's towering performance in it, that gave me the idea for Señorita. And so I wanted to make a queer Filipino film that was different from what they were making at that time.
Señorita is the feature debut of Isabel Sandoval, written, directed, and starring Sandoval herself. Set in the town of Talisay in the Philippines, Donna is a politically active trans woman, originally from Manila, trying to aid an idealistic political candidate into power whilst juggling her secret life as a sex worker. When her life becomes entwined in political corruption, she works hard to maintain her sense of self and also do what she believes is right, trying to keep Tomas, her best friend's son, safe in the process. A political erotic thriller with more ideas than budget, It's a film somewhat limited by form, but that shines in its writing, sincerity, and lead performance. It's singular in that its filmmaker was not out at the time and has said that she used the film as a way to test the waters of living as a woman. This film won the Best Achievement in Film Editing at the Young Critics Circle in the Philippines and was nominated for the Lino Brocca Award at Cine Manila International Film Festival and the Golden Leopard at Locarno International Film Festival. This film is the second film in a row that did not have a Rotten Tomatoes score. I'm picking quite small films, but I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that this was not a film that had a wide release, and that is kind of common with films made in the third world, but the fact that it doesn't really have any kind of score, not even an audience score, is interesting. But on Letterboxd it has a 3.5. This film is really hard to track down to watch. It was on the Criterion channel at one point. I'm not sure if it's still there. I know that Sandoval's work has been reappraised and put more in the public eye after her release of Lingua Franca, which is her most popular film. She's a filmmaker that's quite new and exciting in that she's very interested in genre cinema and starring in them as well. But yeah, this film is very hard to track down. I'm gonna do what I usually do and read a couple of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd just to kind of gauge the opinion. So this first review is by Ave, who says, "Covered in shades of Fassbinder, this movie is such a stunning and passionate portrayal of a trans woman's life. What makes it stand out is setting it in front of the backdrop of a local election and showing the audience a woman trapped by her circumstances, trapped by capitalism, trapped by cisnormativity, doing what she's doing for survival first and foremost. It strikes a deep chord inside I wasn't expecting it to hit. The shame, the double lives, the protection of innocence." Having watched a lot of Sandoval's interviews, watched and listened to Sandoval's interviews, and also watched her other films, I wasn't really surprised by the competence of the writing. It is so clear that she loves movies and genre, and it's really exciting to watch a filmmaker, especially in the debut film, be as excited about genre and stories and characters and people as she is, because her films really do reflect that reverence for movies, and that reverence translates to the portrayal of trans women in her movies, of womanhood in general. I'd say I think she has a really interesting point of view on it, but specifically about trans women, especially in a country where trans women are not a protected group of people, specifically engaging with that part of society. It feels really pertinent. A lot of people really emphasize how much humanity Sandoval brings to this movie, and how exciting it is to see someone talk so articulately about what it means to be a trans woman. This next review is by Dr. Ethan Lyon, who says, "Its depiction of both queer sexuality in the Philippines and the stark reality of political corruption is direct and unflinching but never maudlin, something that she very vehemently attempts to avoid." I agree with this review, firstly, but I think there is such a sincere attempt to give this film edge, if you know what I mean, that I think I wasn't really expecting, especially the ending of this film, which the more I think about it is just very very upsetting and kind of ballsy to take a movie to the levels that it gets to. I'm just generally very impressed by this film. It's not actually my favourite Sandoval film, but I'm very impressed by it, and I'm very excited to see more of her work. I have currently watched everything that she's put out. I wanted to track down the original short film that she made. It was also called Señorita, and it was the basis for this feature film, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I'm not sure if the story diverged much. The running theme throughout Sandoval's work is this interest in the inner lives of women and what they choose to hide, what they're forced to hide, and how they move about the world with these secrets inside them. And that's all I'm going to talk about for now, because I'm going to give a spoiler warning. Now, as I was saying, this is a very hard film to track down. This spoiler warning is me saying that I've seen the film and I'm going to talk about it in detail. And if I have enticed you to watch it yourself, then I'd really recommend going to watch it. But beyond this point, I am going to spoil the film for you if you haven't already seen it. So go do what you have to do.
As a filmmaker, I've come to realize, having made 3 feature films, that I really gravitate towards women with secrets in some sense. And, to be specific, these are also women who are either disempowered or marginalized, in some way, who find themselves confronting intensely personal and private problems and dilemmas within a fraught socio-political setting and context. That has become my pet theme in my films. The French filmmaker Jean Cocteau once said that a filmmaker makes the same movie over and over again over the course of their career. And that what he means is that essentially filmmakers revisit, the same or the similar themes, thematic obsessions, and unresolved issues maybe from their own life in their work. And as a psychology major, that idea resonates with me very strongly.
What I want to talk about firstly is that this film talks about political corruption and what needs to be done in order to live in a world where political corruption is a feature, not a bug, of the world, and what you kind of do to deal with that. And I think what I want to start off with is having read so many interviews with Sandoval and made little lists of all the stuff that she has referenced and sown throughout her films, is that Señorita, first and foremost, is a deeply referential film. That's not a bad thing, specifically because she uses genre and references to talk about the Philippines and to talk about being a trans woman. And I think that is honestly the best way to steal, is to steal and then make it your own. Some of the films that she references are Flute, the Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland film about a call girl being stalked. She also references In the Mood for Love, in the colours and the music, and she also references the Fassbinder film Lola, which is a film about a sex worker who is very literally in bed with powerful political figures and ends up kind of becoming corrupted by the proximity she has to the politics in the place that she lives. And once you see all these references, you kind of can't unsee them. And I think a more cynical person would be like, referencing other work this much is kind of like a cop-out, like you couldn't come up with anything yourself. But we're all just like a series of interpolated cultural artifacts. And like I was saying, the references here are like pertinent and also transformative. This isn't a Tarantino situation where he seems just like very hell-bent on recreating a genre set piece or a time set piece with no desire to interrogate it, but rather transplant his own fantasies onto it. Using these important cinematic milestones is not a bad thing, especially because thematically they're all about repression and what happens when a society becomes so repressed that the truth is ineffable. I talked quite a bit about ineffability in the episode on Khan, so I'm happy he's come back. It's almost as if I am trying to do a specific series on international cinema. I'm gonna do what I usually do at this point in the podcast, and I'm gonna sit you down and give you a history lesson. And it's not my favourite part to do, but I also think it's kind of essential because before going into this, I didn't really know anything about the Philippines. And now I know probably more than I should. But I'm going to give the disclaimer that I'm not a historian. I'm also not from the Philippines. I am merely someone who watched quite a few documentaries and read some books and some articles, and I'm collating them here, and I'm summarizing and being succinct, but I'm also inviting you to watch and read yourselves. I'm gonna link what I reference like I usually do, but as this is a media analysis podcast, I'm trying to just give some context because I think it is thematically relevant to the film. The two pieces of research I'm going to be referencing in this section: Jonathan Beller's Acquiring Eyes, Philippine Visuality, National Struggle, and Alice Guillermo's Media and Thought Control, The Subjugated Consciousness. And just so I'm not like moving back and forth, I'll just say I will be referencing these like intermittently, so it's gonna sound like I'm just like reading bullet points, but I am just like summarizing this very like interesting work that I think is relevant to this section. The US-backed war on the Filipino people, waged by the fascist aspiring dictatorship and an army of bureaucrat capitalists, military personnel and co-opted intellectuals and media, took on violent proportions that would have once been considered intolerable in the West. So we're specifically talking about the inaction of martial law in the 70s under Ferdinand Marcos's totalitarian government at the time. Despite the fact that from the official US perspective, the whole thing just looked like foreign policy as usual, which it was. The beefing up of the military, the plundering of development funds, the seizure of lands, and the enrichment of cronies, among others, became possible through the continual infliction of pain in a variety of forms, from impoverishment to miseducation to torture to murder. What becomes clear from any study of martial law is that the near universal condition of the bourgeois society in which the state makes continuous low-intensity warfare on its citizens was manifest as a continuous state of emergency papered over by Marcos-sponsored spectacles. This violence was layered over the already existing forms of historical violations ranging from urban squalor, factory exploitation to feudalist indentured quasi-slavery. This warfare on the people was the road to credibility or creditability, where the state could demonstrate its control in order to borrow US funds and then borrow more funds to service its debt. Thus, the dictatorship paved the way for finance capital. To manage it all, militarization was accompanied by lavish cultural projects and Imelda Marcos's vision for the Philippines. Throughout the duration of the Marcos regime, the state manipulation of the print and broadcast media was not an occasional effort but a total and systemic operation to break their spirit of freedom and to make them an adjunct of state power. The context for Filipino cinema is similar to like a lot of journeys a national cinema goes through, is that there's a period, almost always a period, where stuff is very heavily censored because there is a crackdown on national identity and the safety of the state and the like overtones of fascism, that there is someone coming to corrupt you and we have to protect you as the government. The context for that, and then the actual meta narrative of the film is that this has not gone away, that even in present day, and within the case of the film it would be like 2011, that this goes on continuously but on a much smaller scale. We're talking local government. So Donna in the film is an active part of Doc Pepe's campaign for councillor, which in the grand scheme of things is not like the most powerful position, but it is significant to that community. There are powers outside of this community's control that doesn't want that wants a specific other candidate. A radical candidate, in this case Doc Pepe, would believe stuff like bad government is the cause of poverty, which is something that is explicit and true and is why this candidate is dangerous for people already in established power. Ricky Verano is a prominent figure that kind of lurks throughout the film, firstly as like Donna's client, but then as the film goes on we learn more and more that he plays a significant role in the makeup of local government, and he has specific ties to the current mayor Chiang, and we learn bits and pieces that he has a monopoly over the community due to his family name. And it's with this context, and I guess like the further context of the Philippines, that begs the question, and it's a deeply relatable question of like, how do you survive doing the right thing? Because under martial law, a lot of political detractors, that is code for communists, were tortured, salvaged, and murdered by the state. And this is framed as for the greater good. So if the greater good is simply maintaining the status quo of not having anyone who is going to question or detract from the current power system, and you are someone who does not benefit from the system and you want it to change, how do you do this without putting yourself in danger? The conclusion the film kind of comes to is that you don't. It's a dangerous world. If you are like Donna, if you're a trans woman who's also a sex worker, who is also caring for your friend's child, who has to lead a life where the options are very, very small, and you want the right person to win. So what do you do? Like, what do you do? If corruption is a game, then you learn to play the game. And Donna, kind of by accident, but something that she takes in stride, she becomes a double agent. She's in the literal bed of Ricky Verano, and also working from the other side, trying to get Doc Pepe into government. And as the film goes on, it just gets more and more dangerous. We hear of people turning up dead. We hear of Ramon. Ramon is a significant character because he is also a double agent. He is also trapped by circumstance. And he does actually say at one point, "My life belongs to a demon." There are no options for good people to make. There is no good and safe option. You either accept that the world is kind of dangerous, that people are just going to turn up dead, that there are drugs in your community and you can't get them out, or you do something about it and you physically put yourself in danger and potentially end up dead. All of this is the antithesis of the idealist, which is Doc Pepe, who in a sense sits in a place of privilege because he seems very willing to accept that he could lose. Whereas Donna is ardent that he cannot lose, that her safety kind of depends on him winning this election. He can align himself with the church and he can say stuff like he wants to keep his hands clean, he doesn't want to do any bribing or under the table action, but he was not going to win without any of this action. Like, Donna is kind of key to the success of the campaign. She literally uses Ricky's blank check to fund this campaign, to make sure that he wins. And it's a selfless action that ultimately is her undoing, and there is no correct action. And I think that's what the film emphasizes. There is no correct way that this could have gone, that she was damned doing it and that she was damned if she didn't do it. It's really interesting to make a film like that. So Sandoval did an interview with the Queer Review where she said, "For some reason I gravitate towards these complex women characters who are arguably anti-heroines, in that they're not necessarily easy to love or understand, but they are, to me at least, closest to what it means to be fully human, in that we're defined by paradoxes and contradictions, and sometimes we act on things when we're not clear what's motivating us. We act against our better judgment sometimes." That kind of encapsulates everything. When you're trapped in a corner, how do you act? And how, when you're watching a film, is your perception of the female characters being informed by misogyny and the inherent distrust of women? I think men get so much leeway in the movies that they're in, that even when they do bad things, that we still are invited to identify with them. And this is just like a lot harder for a lot of audience. The unlikable female character is kind of a trope in of itself, because it's very easy for people to dislike women. And this is even when we have all the context of why someone is doing something. The films that I love the most are about women who make really bad decisions, who are cruel and mean sometimes, who insist on taking a path that is not going to end well. Within the context of political corruption, as I've probably emphasised quite a bit, there is no correct option here. The political corruption runs deep. Donna says he's not gonna let me go. He specifically maintained this relationship with Donna over several years, even when she moved from Manila to Talisay in order to ingratiate herself in a smaller community and just like get away from that life. It's something that she's had to maintain. When she does bad things like taking corrupt man's money to fund the political campaign or defacing Chiang Sun's posters with the word kupal, it means asshole. When she defaces the posters and then lets someone else take the blame for it. When she talks really degradingly about one of the younger girls who's campaigning with them, she talks about how she'd be really good at giving a blowjob. When she seems to act in more like unsettled and unhinged ways, it's all very understandable. This is a woman going through massive amounts of stress and is kind of eager for her situation to change. And she's trying to brute force it because this is not an easy situation to leave, especially because she exists in a world where her friends don't know anything about her life and they're very derogatory towards sex work, and it is made very clear that she can't confide in them about her inner life. Towards the end of the film, she explicitly says, "I don't belong with people here." She's come to the conclusion that she's just become what she despises and that she's just as corrupt as the people in power, and that despite her situation, she has the power to just like make this community better and then leave and return to a life that she doesn't like, that she doesn't get to enjoy the quote-unquote spoils of her actions. She must now exercise herself from this community. And it's sad. It's really sad. The ending of this film is bleak. It made me very upset. And all of this ends with like the exposure of Donna's secret life to the one person who showed her some like respect and who like wanted to know more about her. This boy who's like barely a teenager, Thomas. She is humiliated in front of him by Ricky showing him her sex tape, and it's just this massive, deflating, kind of endless moment right at the end where all of her corruption was literally for nothing, because Ricky still has his thumb over everything. He's still going to expose everything, and this was just part of his plan the whole time. Everything was for nothing, like literally. Her one act of defiance is choosing not to conform by, at least at this point in her life, even if it means her death, choosing to defy this evil, evil man who's going to destroy everything is the one time that she can sincerely do a selfless act that is a good thing. It's horrible because it's not really a choice. The ending itself kind of emphasizes that hope and idealism are exhausting, and they're for people who are already in a good situation. They're for people who are rich and who are cis and who have the power and influence to do things without much effort. This, within the context of the Philippines as a country, is damning, and I'd also say it feels like a film in mourning because there is something missing from Filipino culture where a trans woman and a sex worker has no other options and all that's left is survival. To what extent is being a Filipino citizen just survival?
When I made Señorita, my first film, I wanted to make a Filipino and queer film that no other contemporary Filipino queer filmmaker was doing, and I continued, following that impulse in my second and third feature films.
So what I'd like to talk about now is probably the theme most pertinent to this podcast, the way that Señorita talks about transness in relation to identity and also sex work. I'm going to give a little bit of a history dump because it's always important to talk about LGBT culture specific to the countries that I'm talking about, because I've made the mistake in the past of kind of talking quite generally about what is mostly US politics with the occasional UK politics in the background. So I've done some research into how queerness and transness kind of functions in the Philippines, and you will not be shocked to know that a lot of it is quite affected by colonization, which is something that I discussed quite a bit in the previous episode that I did. But as with the previous section, as I'm doing a history dump, I am just gonna say my sources up top so I'm not having to flick back and forth. The first thing I'm referencing is an article by Carlos Diego A. Razul, who wrote an article titled The History of LGBTQ plus Visibility in the Philippines. And I'm also going to be referencing Harriet Chan's article on queer mythology in the Philippines. And obviously I'll link both of those down below. The first account of women and gender crossing men playing major roles in the Philippine society was the Babylon, a priestess who was a bounty of knowledge and spirituality. The Babylon even had the power to take charge of the barangay community in the absence of the datu, community leader. There were some Babylon who were male, called asog, who were free to have homosexual relations without societal judgment. The asog were not cross-dressers, however. They were gender crossers, as they were granted the same spiritual recognition as the female Babylon. The asog led revolts against the oppression of the Spanish colonial period with various incantations to boost the revolt's strength. During the 300-year Spanish colonization of the Philippines, a change in ideology was imminent. From the indigenous matriarchy, the Spanish introduced the patriarchy and the machismo concept, which made gender crossing a ridiculed practice. It was not long until even effeminate men were also looked down upon, developing regional vernacular for what the Tagalog call. So I'm just going to pause here for a second, because in the text I'm referencing, they use a word where in some sources it is considered a slur, but also it's a really common word in Tagalog to refer to gay and trans people. I'm going to play it safe and I'm not going to say it here. It is something that reoccurs both in the film and in like a lot of queer documentaries about the Philippines. So that's why there's like an awkward pause just there. So this article references that word. I'm not going to say it, just in case it is a slur. But it's a word that, in this article, it says it refers to a gay man, but it also means confused and cowardly. The American colonization period further reinforced a Western conceptualization of gender and sexuality, cementing it in formal education. Lakapati, or Ikapati, is the goddess of fertility and good harvest. She was also described as an androgynous, intersex, or transgender goddess. According to myth, she was one of the kindest deities, giving man the gift of agriculture. Pre-colonial Filipinos would offer sacrifices to her before planting a new field. The ceremony was described by a Franciscan missionary who said he saw a farmer paying homage to his fertility goddess. He would hold up a child before saying, "Lakapati, feed this thy slave, let him not hunger." In some versions of the myth, Lakapati is the consort of Bathala, the creator of the world. Bathala can also be considered to be intersex, as the name means man and woman in one. I think what we're noticing as I go through this season where I discuss international cinema is that a lot of pre-colonial cultures had a more nebulous idea of sex and gender, and that gender non-conformity, which in and of itself is kind of a problematic term in this case, because it's not as if the gender roles were very strict to begin with. But what we're finding is that a lot of trans and intersex people, or just androgynous people, were considered to be holy or of the gods, or to have like some deeper connection with a higher power. And as Catholicism was forced upon the Filipino people, more strict gender roles came in and more repression came in. And as your culture becomes mocked and derided, you are kind of taught to conform or be punished. If the only word you have to refer to yourself is literally a slur, then it's quite hard to talk about gender difference. That kind of comes up in the film, where Donna is not really derided, I'd say, for being trans. I think for a lot of people in her ordinary day life, it doesn't seem to be an issue. She's not really misgendered or talked down to, which is unique for a film about someone in a small community. But her transness plays a key part in her sex work. Let's talk about the laws in the Philippines regarding trans people. So according to Equaldex, the only article that may apply to LGBT people is Article 200 of the Penal Code, which cites serious sexual misconduct. But there were never any laws against homosexuality and no laws restricting discussion or promotion of LGBTQ+ topics. Filipinos who undergo gender reassignment surgery are not permitted to change their legal gender per a Supreme Court ruling in 2007. The Magna Carta for public social workers assures protection from discrimination, including sexual orientation and sex, but does not specify gender identity. Some jurisdictions offer protections for sexual orientation and gender identity, but not all of them. According to an article written by Chiang titled "How the Queer History of the Philippines Inspires Our Struggle Today," the first bill seeking to end gender-based discrimination was filed in Congress in 2000. More than 20 years later, the Anti-Discrimination Bill, also called the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity and Expression Equality Bill, has yet to overcome opposition from various groups and become law. What we have is a culture that is still kind of reeling from this repression, as is kind of common across many countries in the world. Protections for trans people in particular are just not in place within the law, regardless of whether their friends and family accept them, whether they're welcomed in the community, is all well and good. And it's definitely a large part of trans liberation and trans acceptance. If the government doesn't recognise and protect the rights of trans people, massive issues are going to occur when those people are under threat from hate groups, from abuse and harassment, when they don't have protections in work, so they have to do jobs like sex work in order to make a living, which capitalism requires everyone to do. It's all one big loop, and it all comes back to colonization. In an interview with Harper's Bazaar, Isabel Sandoval said, "I left the Philippines years ago, and in certain respects, I'm sad to say this, it no longer feels like my home, because about 10 years ago, they passed this law prohibiting trans people from changing their name and gender marker. The law did not exist, but they went out of their way to become bigots." This is also in conjunction / reinforced by the way trans people exist in cinema in general. And so you have the combination of bigotry against trans people in general, with the massive influence that Hollywood has had over Filipino cinema, and it all kind of coalesces to something like relatively familiar, which is that trans people are not often complex characters with inner worlds. So in an interview with the Queer Review, Sandoval said, "In the Philippines, on film and in pop culture, trans and queer people are almost always portrayed as these stock stereotypical caricatures and oftentimes objects of ridicule." I don't think that's unfamiliar. I've talked about the documentary Disclosure, which looks at the way that trans people have been portrayed in American cinema and TV, and it talks about it from the perspectives of all these trans actors who can talk about it from a first-hand account. In that documentary, it's a similar kind of story. Unfortunately, bigotry transcends culture and borders when you need to confirm that any kind of difference of expression or identity that is not familiar or aligns with like Catholic values or the gender binary in a traditional sense, that needs to be suppressed. And the way that you do that is that you make being a trans person impossible, and you can reinforce that culturally by just making it seem ridiculous that anyone could be trans in the first place. We are seeing that today all over the place. It's a lot of fun. Independent cinema, especially in the Philippines, has been key for expressing radical leftist ideas, and that's been quite consistent. There's this really good timeline on, I'll link it below, I can't remember the actual title of the website, but it's this timeline of Filipino cinema where it kind of looks at it alongside culture. And from what I've been like watching and researching, the desire to like document radical ideas has been quite consistent in Filipino cinema. I think the use of documentary, especially from like filmmakers like Nick de Campo, have been key in expressing ideas that have been trying to contest the more fascist ones, which have unfortunately risen to the surface. So on this timeline, the 2000s and the advance of the internet made it a lot easier for independent filmmakers to make movies. Like, you didn't need a studio system, you didn't need government permission. From what I was reading, this also did make piracy like very, very easy in the Philippines, which is something that Sandoval said was a deterrent from her continuing to make movies there, that she really wanted the opportunity to have her film distributed and seen by a lot of people before it ended up on pirating sites. I think the advantage of independent cinema is that you're not beholden to a potentially bigoted financier. When I was talking about In Between, I was talking about how the director of that movie sought funds from the State of Israel to make a movie about 3 Palestinian women trying to exist in an increasingly kind of divisive world, and how the idea of taking money from a state that fundamentally doesn't believe that you're worth telling a story about in the first place, and that if you took that money, you wouldn't be able to criticize the state of Israel itself, and you wouldn't be able to represent the IDF as anything negative. You're in this bind where you either make something that nobody will see, but it's deeply radical, it's a full coherent expression with progressive ideas. You won't be seen, and it will potentially end up being pirated, and you won't make any money off it because of that, so you won't be able to make any more movies. Or you go to a potentially government funded body who is not very interested in representing a trans woman with complex ideas and an inner world and a secret that potentially criticizes government bodies and government officials. What is the option here? First time filmmakers, like feature debuts, you get a lot of leeway because no one knows anything about you yet. You are kind of there to establish your voice, to throw everything out there. As a result, I think people are more, I guess, forgiving of what you can't do. I'm more impressed with what you've been able to do. And I personally love watching a filmmaker like stretch themselves with so little, and that sounds really bad. The ability to be concise and to also just do things kind of makeshift is impressive. And when you're trying to tell a story about a trans woman who is having to negotiate these 2 sides of her identity, this like public facing canvasser for this political candidate, and also this sex worker who kind of has to be whatever the fantasy calls for. It's impressive to be able to have this much movement, to like make a character who is not as simple, I guess, as the like more bigoted portrayals, but also the more like digestible, clean cut portrayals either. And I know this was in like 2011 and also in the Philippines, but I would say that the desire for a homogenized, correct version of representation at times makes it feel like we're encouraging filmmakers to become advertisers for marginalized identities rather than storytellers who want to express ideas and frustrations, and more importantly, themes that contest, contradict, or even like gel with ideas that need to be expressed, or simply just establish that something even exists in the first place. Sometimes I think the pushback against negative representation feels like more of a pushback against conflict. I've noticed this more and more. Some people kind of derogatorily use the word tenderqueer to refer to people who only really watch these very sanitized depictions of queerness. So they will exclusively watch like media for children or Disney products. And these are often the people who are, I guess, like cited as being anti-sex, anti-violence in queer media. And I think the problem with this is that these stereotypes already exist in the world. So when you ask the LGBT creators, filmmakers, writers, producers, storytellers in general, when you ask that they don't touch on these topics, they can't be challenged. The stereotype of the trans woman who is also a sex worker is really common in films, like really, really common. If you want to challenge stigma around labor, around trans women, around sex work, and around the violence that can come with all three of these topics, there has to be some leeway. There has to be space to discuss it in the first place. So I worry when people are very, very adverse to any kind of depiction of violence against trans women or violence against sex workers, that you're kind of stopping people who have experienced this, who want to talk about it, who want to make art about it. You're stopping them from even potentially starting a conversation about it, as well as, more importantly, challenging these stereotypes, because it's not as if there is no truth there. It's more that what is being expressed when trans women are only able to be these side characters who are stereotyped and often end up being assaulted or murdered for the sake of conflict in a cis and straight person story. In the Philippines, according to the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, engaging in sex work is illegal under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code. This law only applies to women engaging in sex work. In the Philippines, there is the Nordic model currently in place. To my knowledge, I think I could only really find sources from like 2018 to 2020. It could have changed since then. But if you don't know about the Nordic model, a very, very, very simplified version of it is that it makes the act of being a sex worker legal, but purchasing sex work illegal. And I'm pretty sure it also outlaws brothels and what would be like pimps or madams, who could literally be anyone who is helping a sex worker gain work or even providing security for a sex worker. It's a bad model. There are so many rebuttals against the Nordic model and how it doesn't actually protect sex workers at all. How it kind of feeds into this myth of what human trafficking is meant to be. I don't have time to cover that here. What I'm saying is that there is a stigma specifically against women who do sex work that is reinforced legally in this case. In an article by Mike Intong Campbell titled The Precarity and Motherhood in Philippine Trans Cinema, they say trans women have long been engaged in the sex industry in the Philippines, which puts their physical and mental health at risk. Sex work is also highly criminalized in the country, and trans women are often targeted by outdated laws like the anti-vagrancy law, which are meant to curb the sex work industry. I think what we're seeing is the coalescence of hard Catholicism, this myth of the sex worker that needs to be protected, and also anti-trans bigotry all coming together at once. And we can see how this informs the way Donna exists in the world. For like most of the movie, her real job is not known to the people around her, and she has to pretend that she has been attending what are known as like Miss Gay beauty pageants, which are far more common in the Philippines than I thought they were. So they're basically a beauty pageant for trans women and also I think drag queens to compete in like a beauty contest. It's contested whether it's a celebration of queer culture or if it's just what would be the equivalent of a circus or a freak show. I couldn't get like a straight answer really. I watched a couple of videos and documentaries about them, and it seemed more leaning on this was like a mocking thing, but within the context of the film, it's meant to be, in her public-facing life, the only way that she's kind of earning real money during these beauty pageants. And she maintains this life by like buying flowers and a trophy and a crown and like a sash after she has finished work. And then she goes back home and she shows Thomas, who's like, yay, congratulations, you won. I would like to attend one of these, actually. In the film, Donna becomes this kind of surrogate mother to Thomas. In a sense, it's one of the only relationships that I believe isn't kind of relying on any outer system of power, because the main reason that Donna is looking after Thomas in the first place is because Thomas's mother is working overseas and there's no one to look after him. Donna steps up to do that because she loves her friend and she loves Thomas and she's available. So the reason why I'd say that this is one of like the most pure of intentions relationships in the film is because everyone else kind of expects something from Donna. As a result, she kind of doesn't have anyone to turn to, really. Her friends that she's canvassing with expect her to be like an upstanding citizen who's going to help Doc Pepe's campaign as much as possible. And her identity for Ricky is this kind of fantasy of this like springboard for him to project his ideas of trans womanhood onto her. For Thomas, he really just wants a friend. He's like, I want to go watch your pageants and I want you to come watch my basketball games. There's this barrier that exists, the kind of barrier that you'd have with a parent, rather than this prescribed idea of what she should be. So it's not the sense that she's performing because she'd be rejected. She's performing because our parents have this kind of distance from us where they are on a different level of what they know about the world. So it's a relationship of protection rather than of necessity. Ramon refers to Donna as both Thomas's mother and father. I think he's trying to be shitty in this moment about Donna's transness. There is this kind of unity in how Donna is having to be multiple things at once, how they all kind of coalesce in this singular woman, where the transphobic implications of what he's saying are more explicit. The duplicitousness of Donna's identity exists out of a need to keep the balance. So in the same way that Donna has to act as mother and father to Thomas, she has to maintain this balancing act of politically active community member and also sex worker who mostly works for a very powerful man. As a conclusion to this bit, Sandoval's Woman with a Secret exists as a constantly fluctuating balancing act between public facing and private womanhood. And the way this kind of intersects with transness is that Donna's situation is more precarious than I think even the film lets on, because Donna's life is not free from violence and she comes away from a lot of violence that feels like a very close call. And I think what the film comes to the conclusion of is that a society that is unable to discuss its difficult or repressed ideas openly is a society that is going to burst at the seams with great acts of violence. And by great, I mean like massive, not like good, that the most vulnerable are going to bear the brunt of. So when you have very hard and fast laws against sex work, when you have very hard and fast laws against transness, you force the people who have to exist in both of these spheres to act in ways where their self-preservation could potentially put them in more danger.
I am an independent filmmaker that wants to really make a mark, in the international scene. I can't just do what everyone else is doing, and we shouldn't do that. I wanted to do something different. It was a risk, of course, because you don't know what, festival programmers are going to respond to. But I think because they realized and they saw that what I was doing was in fact different, that I had a place in the world of filmmaking, primarily because of that. And because I was an only child, I think, and my mom really encouraged me to be who I am, like, I really celebrated my otherness, so to speak. Because of that, I became fearless and just bold to do what I wanted to do as an artist and as a storyteller. And that's what we should all do. These attributes that were supposed to marginalize us, or make us invisible and delegitimize us. Like, for me, I didn't buy into that. And that's why I never thought my point of view was inferior or mediocre. Every legendary artist or considered a unique artist just had the confidence and the boldness to kind of do their art their own way. And I think that's what seduces audiences.
The final part of the podcast I'd like to dedicate to talking about masculinity, both the way that it is conceived as part of Filipino culture and the way that it's portrayed in the film. So the very first thing that we're introduced to in Señorita is Donna meeting up with a client called Julius. And we learn that part of his fantasy is being emasculated by this woman. And the fact that she's trans is also part of that, because during the fantasy, she calls him gay and she refers to him as being uncircumcised, both of which denote a lack of masculinity within the fantasy, which is, part of the thrill for this client. I'm going to discuss circumcision very briefly because I fell down some rabbit holes when researching this podcast. The thing that I got kind of caught up on was like trying to discern different cultural practices and what different words mean. And I wouldn't have even got hung up on this if in the film referring to men as being uncircumcised, it comes up multiple times to the point where I couldn't really ignore it, where I'm sure if a audience in the Philippines was watching this film, it would be like the equivalent of, I guess, using the F slur or calling someone a pussy. This source isn't necessarily reliable, but there's a website called Untranslatable, which specifically translates colloquial phrases in Tagalog. So the word was defined by a user as someone who is uncircumcised, and this is used as an insult to demean and mock a man's ability, I suppose, to be a man. I also found an article on Channel News Asia about the practice of circumcision in the Philippines and what is known as circumcision season, where adolescent boys will all get circumcised at the same time. So I'm quoting the article here. It says, the roots of circumcision in the Philippines can be traced back to the arrival of Islam in 1450. A circumcised boy is no longer treated as a young boy and is given more adult roles within the family. And that article also said that it is considered a slur, which refers specifically to someone as a coward. There is this idea that, whilst I don't necessarily think it's the main theme of the film, there is this very strict gendering of people where Tomas is being pulled away from Donna. He's made to view her as a trans woman and as a sex worker and view both of these things as demeaning and worth ridicule. There's nothing scarier in a queer movie than a group of teenage boys. And whilst there is only really one scene with Tomas's school friends, it does a lot to portray how homosexuality grooms young men into a kind of specific kind of masculinity. And it's not that unfamiliar than the lads that I grew up going to school with, or the kind that you'd maybe see in an American movie. They share porn together, they peer pressure each other to smoke, they catcall women on the street, but specifically they refer to Donna as Tomas's gay mother, and in turn refer to him as gay as well. And it's key that after having his masculinity insulted, that Tomas takes a cigarette. Now, it's quite a simple scene. It's quite a simple point that it's evidencing, but it is key to kind of understanding the way that it's not as easy to diverge from the crowd, and it's not as easy to defend people we love from bigotry, because it results in us being targeted for harassment as well. That's not to say that it's not selfish, but it is kind of a reality that when it comes to trans people, a lot of cis people, even those who know trans people, who are family members of trans people, who are in relationships with trans people, a lot of the time they are unwilling to stick their neck out for fear of violence as well. And I think the ending of this film really does evidence that, because in trying to be invited into Donna's world, Tomas gets roped into this corrupt political plot where he nearly ends up dead. And it's a really kind of bleak message that the pillar of masculinity in this film is Ricky Verano, and it's his corruption, it's his power, it's his domination over Donna and the community of Talisai that makes him a man. And for Tomas, for people like Ramon, there isn't really a role model or leader or divergent point from this, except maybe Doc Pepe, who, as I've already discussed, only gets his position because of the specific corruption in the film. Tomas's one dream is to go to Manila and see Donna win a beauty pageant. And the film ends with him getting to go to Manila, but it is this twisted version of this dream and this kind of bleak portrayal of sexuality that he's exposed to before he's ever really given the chance to process who Donna is for himself. And the ending of this is so effective and so legitimately disturbing that I found it hard to watch both of the times that I watched it in preparation for this podcast. The fact that Tomas is made to watch his guardian's sex tape and then nearly murdered is really bleak, and I think it speaks to this kind of oppressive masculinity that is suffocating these people, and that it only really bursts and comes undone for these characters right at the end, where we don't know what's going to happen next or how this is going to end. And the future is potentially hopeful in that there is a new leader who seems to want to do good things, but if all of the other characters in the film have these hidden inner lives, there is this calling into question of everyone, isn't there? If Donna can have these two lives, if Ramon can have these two lives, if Ricky can have these two lives, so could anyone in that position of power. And what does it mean when the position itself is a corrupting force? What does it mean for the people who are relying on this as a force for good? It just feels like so analogous to strict gendered positions in society, and especially masculinity. And the fact that we don't get a clear ending of how these people's lives continue after the film ends, it just makes it all the more bleak. So I'll ask the question, does this film look like a badger? This is a very flawed project that I think has some absolutely excellent writing. It is low budget, but full of sincerity, very obviously referential to the people who have seen the films Sandoval is referencing. But I don't believe that it's a bad thing, because I think that she builds upon these references and applies them specifically to the time and place that she's making the film. She has a clear grip on genre and tone and is able to take her film to genuinely upsetting lengths in order to tell a complex story of a woman stuck in the midst of corruption and survival. I'm going to leave you with some recommendations because I'm nice, because this episode has been all over the place. So the first film I'm going to recommend is another film by Sandoval called Apparition. Now, for me, I think this is Isabel Sandoval's strongest film. I also think that it's really, really bleak, and please go into it with caution. So the film is set in a convent just before martial law comes into place in the Philippines, and it follows a group of nuns who are left reeling after a violent sexual assault puts blame on a woman trying to come to terms with the torture and murder of her brother. It's a very heavy film, and I don't think it pulls any punches. I think it's a very angry film about hive mind and totalitarianism and gender and guilt. It's a film that kind of comes to life if you've watched a lot of films about martial law and you've read a lot about Ferdinand Marcos, but it's also something that can entirely be enjoyed without that knowledge as well. It really does pull you into that world. The second film I'd like to recommend is Clute, which I did mention earlier, specifically because it is referenced in this film. In Clute, Jane Fonda plays a sex worker being stalked by a mysterious force, and Donald Sutherland plays a private investigator looking into the disappearance of a close friend, potentially connected with Jane Fonda's character. It's a very good film. The performances are excellent. It's a very moody and marginally depressing film that is filled with so much life. I think there are sections of Señorita that are fully lifted from this film. I think the ending of Clute is also quite similar, though I'd say Clute is marginally more optimistic, but that's just the Americans for you. The last film that I'm going to recommend is a documentary called Signs. It is also called Omens in some places. It is a documentary from the 80s, coming from the Philippines, reflecting on the effects of martial law. And it's basically all these interviews with all of these different leftists. They include filmmakers and nuns and activists, and they discuss communism and subversive politics in relation to the Marcos regime. It's really interesting. Thank you very much for listening. I will be back shortly with more bonus episodes covering new releases, as well as my regularly scheduled deep dive in October. Halloween. Ooh. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgerPod. Please follow me on Spotify, YouTube, and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you would like to read any more of my work, you can find my writing at ambercanwalk.com. All of my sources are also in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Bye bye!